What did this young farmer do? The last time he harvested his hay, instead of taking it to the market to sell, he stored it at the back of his farm. And then he went out and he started building himself a haystack, and he kept building it and building it and building it until it was about 10 or 11 feet high. So it had this huge base. And then he went out one night and he proceeded to dig the inside of that haystack out so that there would be enough room for my dad and his family to hide inside of that haystack. And for the next 6 weeks, for 23 hours and 30 minutes of every single day, they lived inside of that haystack. The only time they came out was very late at night or very early in the morning, when at risk to their own lives, Gorski, Salki, or Wisniewski would bring them food every night. They would go out, get some fresh air, use the bathroom, and then go back inside and wait till the next day. Then Gorski informed him that the Nazis were no longer looking for Jews to kill. They had actually brought Jews back to the ghettos because they needed them for work. But they didn't want old Jews, they didn't want young Jews. My dad's parents were too old, his sisters too young, so it was decided that my mom, my dad, and Chaim would sneak into the ghetto because my dad felt he could help his parents more from inside of the ghetto. When my dad left the haystack that night, that would be the last time he ever saw his parents or his sisters alive again. They found out that there was another ghetto, a large ghetto in Poland, in a place called Sokół. So my dad's father thought that it would be safer for him than hiding out where they were, that they would eventually get caught. So they got on a train in a little village called Myslovice, where he had one of his mills that he had turned over to some Polish friends of theirs in hopes that he would get it back after the war was over. And they got on the train took off, and it stopped in their hometown of Hrubieszów. Passengers got on. The train started to take off, and then it stopped. Somebody who had gotten on in their hometown recognized my dad's family, knew that they were Jews, and turned them in for the reward. The Nazis took them off the train, and they shot them dead there. Meanwhile, my mom, my dad, and Chaim, and my mom's best friend Tova Borenstein are in the ghetto with 196 other Jews. The only Jew that's not working in the ghetto, and the work that they were doing, you all, were cleaning out all the homes, the Jewish homes of all the personal belongings to be sent back to Germany, was my dad. Instead, he was assigned to the fort that the Nazis had taken over to work with the animals there, to wash them, the horses, the donkeys, and to take care of them. After about 3 months, the Nazis decide too many Jews, not enough work. Janek Salki, that 13-year-old boy who had snuck into the ghetto late at night to warn my dad and his family about the last deportation, snuck into the ghetto in broad daylight, found my mother, and warned her to go find her brother because the Nazis were going to make a selection. My mom found Chaim, and she said, "Come on, we're going to go hide until this is over." And here's this 14-and-a-half-year-old young boy who's lived under the Nazi occupation, confined to the ghettos, was in hiding, back into the ghetto, has no idea what has happened to his family, his mother, his father, the rest of his brothers and sisters. And he just says, "No, I'm tired of hiding, I'm tired of running." So my mom thinks if she takes off running, Chaim will follow her, her brother will follow her. And she makes her way to this little creek and she lies down so she won't be seen. And Chaim didn't follow her. And by this time it's too late. The Nazis have rounded up all the Jews in the ghetto and lined them up to make the selection process. And she watches as her brother Chaim is one of the 100 that's selected and taken away. And that would be the last time that my mother would see her brother. 2 months later, with no warning, the Nazis came into the ghetto, rounded up the last remaining 100 Jews, took them down to the train station where they packed them into cattle cars like that. Wasn't enough room to sit down, people stood up. They gave them no food and no water. Train trip took over 24 hours. They took a bucket and put it in the corner if you had to use the bathroom. But it was so crowded nobody could make their way to the bucket. And people did have to use the bathroom, and they simply used it standing up right where they were. So you can imagine what it smelled like on the inside of that cattle car. Finally, the train stopped. After about 24 hours, it had been stopping all along the way. And obviously, they found out what was happening is they were picking up Jews in other little towns and villages along the way. And they took them and ordered them off the train, and they took them to the first of what would be 13 labor, concentration, and extermination camps that my parents would go through over the next 2 years. First place was a place called Budzin. And as they were approaching the camp, my mom and dad and my mom's friend Tova heard this yelling going on. And they couldn't figure out what it was. And as they got closer, they finally could understand what the Jews inside were yelling. They were yelling out family names, looking for family members that they had been separated from in hopes that maybe they were being brought into the camp. They immediately separated my mom and dad into a men's camp and a women's camp. My dad hooked up with 4 young men that he would eventually go through all the camps with. My mom and her friend Toba hooked up with 3 other young women that they would go through all the camps with over the next 2 years. But it also meant that my mom and dad were no longer able to see each other. On the 3rd or 4th day, my dad found my mother in the food line, and he asked her where her barrack was located, at which point she explained where her barrack was located and what the number was. That night, my dad asked his new friends that he shared a bunk with if they would cover for him if the Nazis came in unexpectedly again, pulled a blanket over their heads so they couldn't tell how many Jews were lying in the bunk. And that night, my dad snuck out of the barrack, avoided the Nazi guards, crawled under the barbed wire fence of the men's camp, across the open area under the barbed wire fence of the women's camp, avoided the Nazi guards, found my mother's barrack where he snuck inside so that he could spend the night there with her. He then got up very early the next morning and snuck back the same way so that he would be there in time for roll call, because every day before the sun came up, all 20,000 Jews in all the camps had to line up and be counted to make sure every single Jew was accounted for. And if not, they would have to stand there all day, whether it was burning sun or freezing snow. And he did this every single night so that he could be with her. And then one night while he was lying there, for some reason, he doesn't know why, he said to her, "Make me a promise." And she said, "Of course." And he said, "Promise me that if something happens and we're separated, when this is over, you will meet me back in our hometown." And she said, "Of course." 2 weeks later, the Nazis came into the women's camp, rounded them up, and took them away. And that would be the last time my mother and father saw each other for 18 months. My mom went on to 4 more camps. The next camp that she was taken to was a place called Mielec in Poland. It was in Mielec that she got the K and the L tattooed on her wrist that I saw as that 6-year-old little boy growing up in Ponca City, Oklahoma. The K and the L stood for Konzentrationlager, or concentration camp, which meant anybody saw the K and the L on their wrist, they would know that that was a Jew who had escaped from a camp. Now, not all the camps did it. Actually, very few camps actually did that. From there, my mom was sent to a place called Plaszow. Plaszow you're all probably familiar with if you saw the movie Schindler's List, because that's the camp that Oskar Schindler took 1,200 Jews that he ended up saving during World War II. From Plaszow, she was taken and put on a train. And as the train was finally slowing down, my mom and her friends began to smell something that they had never smelled before, and they couldn't figure out what this odor was. And finally, the train came to a stop, and they ordered the Jews off of the train. And when those doors were open, that smell hit them 100 times worse, and they just couldn't figure out what this smell was. It was just a terrible odor. And they were told to line up, and every single Jew from the train had to line up in front of an SS colonel. And he would look at every single Jew, and with his thumb would simply go to the right or to the left. 97% of the people were immediately sent to the left. Women with children, young kids, people who didn't look healthy, the elderly were immediately sent to the left. My mom, her 4 friends, and some others were very lucky, although they didn't know it at the time. They were sent to the right. And as they were being led away, they could see the barbed wire fences. These are concrete slabs. All of those fences are electrified. If anybody tried to escape, that they would be electrocuted. And as they were walking by the barracks, my mom saw a group of men on the other side of the fence. And she did the same thing that had been done to her in that first camp at Budzin. And she yelled out, Chaim Nagelstein, looking for her brother. And somebody yelled back to her, yes. And she thought she had found her brother. And again she yelled, Chaim. And the person yelled again, yes, and she saw it wasn't Chaim, and the person yelled to her, I knew him. They took him away yesterday. When my mom was finally, and her friends, taken to their barrack, they went inside, and the other Jews inside of the barrack informed them that they had just been brought to a place called Auschwitz-Birkenau, and the smell that they had been smelling was that of the Jews who were being burned in the crematorium and the ovens. And my mom knew what it meant when the person said they took him away yesterday. My mom, her 4 friends, and 295 other young women were very lucky. They were transferred out of Auschwitz-Birkenau because very few people were, and they were sent to a camp in Czechoslovakia, a place called Lichtenwerden. Now, as you know, I didn't have time to go through what it was like in the camps, but I will give you an example of one thing. My mom was caught doing something, and as her punishment, they took her outside of the barrack in sub-freezing weather and made her kneel down in 3 feet of snow. And they told her that if she as much as moved a muscle, the guards in the tower who were watching her would shoot her dead right there. And they made her kneel in sub-freezing weather in that 3 feet of snow for 24 hours. God only knows how she survived that. But they took her to the infirmary where she got some help, and with the help of her friends, some extra food. On the 3rd day was finally able to go back to the barrack and go to work, because if she had not been able to do that on that 3rd day, they would have shot her dead. March 1945, my mother, her 4 friends, and the rest of the women in Lichtenwerden were liberated by the Russian forces. When my mom was liberated, you all, she was not quite 20 and a half years old. She was 5'1", and she weighed 65 pounds. Meanwhile, my dad and his friends went through 7 more camps. From Budzin, he ended up going to Mielec as well, and from Mielec he was sent to a place in Poland called Wielczyk, which is where famous salt mines were, where he worked in the salt mines. From there he was sent to a camp in Germany called Leitmeritz. From there he was sent to a place called Lichtenberg in Czechoslovakia. From there he was sent to Mauthausen in Austria, the camp that I showed you where the Jews had to walk up those 186 steps with those boulders on their back, which is what my dad had to do with along with his friends. From Mauthausen he was transferred out to Dachau. Dachau, of course, was the very first camp set up by the Nazis. From Dachau he was sent to a place called Koffering. Again, don't have time to go into detail about my dad and what it was like there, but I will tell you this. 3 times he was nearly beaten to death. One time he was beaten so badly he couldn't get out of his bunk to go for the roll call. And if you couldn't do that, they're going to kill you. So his friends literally dragged him out to the roll call line, stood shoulder to shoulder with him, and literally held his body up while they did the count. After the count was over, they drug him back to the barrack and hid him under one of the bunks. And they gradually nursed him back, getting him what little extra food they could, and nursed him back to health until he was able to finally go out himself. From Koffering, which was a subcamp of Dachau, he was taken out on a death march. What the Nazis did as the Allies, the Americans, the British, the French, the other Allies were coming eastward, the Russians were coming westward into Germany, the Nazis would take the Jews out of the camps and literally walk them to death because they did not want them to find live Jews in those camps. If a Jew fell on one of those death marches, they literally shot them dead right there and left them. So my dad and his 4 friends knew they were going to be killed, so they should try and escape. On the 2nd night, there was a light rain coming. They waited until they thought the guards who were watching them in the trees were asleep. And the 5 of them started crawling along the ground for about 100 yards until they finally jumped up and started running as far as their skinny bodies would take them. And they finally found this barn, went inside totally exhausted and fell asleep. And they were awoken the next morning by this dog barking and somebody singing. And one of my dad's friends went and peeked out the door, and sure enough, the German farmer was coming to his barn to do some chores. So they knew they had to hide. So they buried themselves underneath the hay in the barn. They could hear the door open, they could feel the dog running around them, and sure enough, the farmer had to do some chores. And the first chore he had to do was feed his livestock. So he picked up his pitchfork and stuck it into the hay. stuck one of my dad's friends right in the leg. He jumped up and yelled. The farmer's so shocked he yells. My dad and his other 3 buddies jump up out of the hay and they yell, and they're all staring at each other. And they explain to this German farmer who they are. At which point this German farmer then says something incredible, you all. It is April the 19th, 1945. The Nazis know they have lost the war. It is over. In 3 weeks they will sign the surrender and sign the surrender papers. They know they've lost. And yet this young farmer, German farmer, looked at these 5 half-dead skeletons and said, that's why there was a Nazi patrol on my farm last night. They were looking for these 5 half-dead Jews, even though they knew the war was over. So this farmer said to them, wait here, as though they had a choice. You can see the uniforms that they have on with the Star of David. It's broad daylight. What are they going to go marching down the street? So they had to trust him. 20 minutes later, he came back with a basket of food and water. But he told them, you have to leave tonight, because if the Nazis find you here and think I've been helping you all this time, they will kill me and my family. So they promised him they would leave that night. Got dark, they slipped out the door, walked 10 feet and said, where are we going? I have no idea which way to go. They didn't know if they would go this way, if they would walk into the Allies, or go this way and walk into the Nazis. Excuse me. So they decided to wait one more night and get another good night's sleep. They went back inside the barn, fell asleep, and they were awoken the next morning by this rumbling sound. One of my dad's friends went and peeked out the door. And they said, what is it? What is it? And he turned around and looked at them, and he couldn't talk, and there were tears coming down his face. And my dad and his other 3 buddies went over to the door, and they looked out. And when my dad told me this story for the book, he said he had only seen this one other time before in his life, and he had seen it in a book in school. Coming down the road were jeeps and trucks with American flags on them. And my dad and his 4 buddies went outside and were liberated by the American forces. When my dad was liberated, you all, he was not quite 20 years old. He was 5'9", and he weighed 78 pounds. My parents' story is a story about 3 miracles. The first miracle is the fact that they even survived in the first place. When out of 8,500 Jews who lived in Hrubieszów, when the Nazis invaded on September 1st, 1939, less than 100 of them survived the Holocaust. And my mom, her dad, and Toba were 3 of them. The second miracle is that they found each other after the war, got reunited. My dad brought her back to Germany, where they got married. They had a baby, my brother, who was born in Germany. They immigrated to the United States in April of 1950, where when she was examined by the doctor told her that she should not have any more children because of the trauma that she went through. 11 months later, I'm standing before you. Obviously, I came out all right. The third miracle happened 39 years later when I was doing research on the book. And I found my mother's brother Chaim, who we thought had died in Auschwitz-Birkenau, alive and well and living in Newcastle, England. And on January the 30th, 1982, at 11:01 British time, after 39 years of separation, my mother and her brother saw and touched each other again. I already told you some of the reasons of why what happened to my parents over 70 years ago is important to each and every one of you here today. But I want to bring it even home a little bit closer to you. When I was 7 years old, my dad came home from work, and the first thing he did was the same thing he did every day when he came home from work, sat down in his favorite chair, turned on the TV to watch the news. And that particular night, there was a story on TV that really bothered him. And he continued to follow it on TV and in the newspapers. And the first time he had off was Saturday afternoon. I was playing in the backyard, and my dad comes back with my mom and says, "Mike, come with us. We're going to take you for a ride." Okay. We went to the car, and they drove me to a park. They parked the car. We got out and walked into the park. My mom and dad walked me up to a water fountain, and they told me to take a drink out of it. And I did. They said, "How did that taste?" I said, "Hot August day in Oklahoma, cold water from a water fountain, what could be better?" Tasted great. And then my dad asked me to read the sign on the water fountain to him. And I read it to him, and it said, "Whites only." They then walked me to a water fountain not 10 feet away, and they asked me to take a drink out of it. And I did. I said, "How did that taste?" I said, "The same as the water over there." At which point my dad then asked me to read the sign on that water fountain to him. And I read it to him, and it said, "Coloreds only." We walked back to the car without saying a word, and my parents drove me down to the bus station. We walked inside, nice area, nice chairs, ceiling fans going on this hot August day. And my mom and dad walked me up to this stand that had a sign on it. And the two of them said, "Read the sign with us." And the three of us read the sign together, and it said, "White waiting area." We then walked to the back of the bus station, not so nice area, broken chairs, no ceiling fans going on this hot August day, and a sign up on the wall. And again, my parents asked me to read the sign with them. And the three of us read the sign, and it said, "Colored waiting area." And my dad looked at me, his 7-year-old son, and he said, "I want you to always remember what I've shown you here today, because that's the reason that you don't have any grandparents and lots of aunts and uncles and cousins, because people looked at them as being different and inferior human beings." What my dad saw on TV that day, you all. Let me ask you a question here. Anybody recognize any of those names there that are up there? 13 names. Nobody recognizes them. Those 13 people right there, you all, changed the course of American history. The story that my dad saw, you all, was of 13 young black kids, age 6 to 16, with their adult supervisor, Clara Looper, who went to downtown Oklahoma City, walked into a place called Cat's Drug Store, sat down at the counter, and ordered 13 Coca-Colas, and were refused service because of the color of their skin. And they remained there, and they sat there very patiently. It closed the next day, they walked out, and they were the first customers there the next day, and they sat down again. By this time, other people had started coming to see what was going on. And by this time, people had started yelling at them, calling them names, spitting on them, actually shoving them. They went back for 4 days. And on that 4th day, the corporation that owned Cat's Drug Store sent out a letter to all 22 of its other drugstores that it owned in Kansas, Missouri, Arkansas, and Oklahoma, and told their drugstores that you will begin serving your black customers. And what did those 13 young kids do? They moved on to the next place. Those 13 young kids started the sit-in movement in this country. It didn't start in North Carolina with college students. It started with those 13 young kids, aged 6 to 13, who said, "We are not going to allow to take this anymore." They helped integrate, broke down the barriers of segregation, integrated Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and this entire country. 13 young kids, age 6 to 16. Why do I tell you that story? Because that's the story that my dad saw. And it's also important that you understand, do not think for a moment, you all, that there isn't anything that you can't do to have an impact on the world around you. Just like those 13 young kids, age 6 to 16. After World War II, you all, the world said never again would we allow something like this to happen, like the Holocaust. Never again. President Lyndon Johnson, 1968, Nigeria. 1 million ethnic Igbos are murdered by their own government as the United States and the world sits back and watches. Never again. President Richard Nixon, 1971. 1 to 2 million Bengalis are murdered by their own Pakistani government. Over 200,000 Bengali women are raped by Pakistani soldiers. Anybody know why those soldiers were going and raping the Bengali women? Anybody have any idea? What religion are the Bengali women? Anybody know? Take a guess. No. They're Muslim. Anybody know what happens in the Muslim religion if a woman has sex outside of marriage or with somebody who is not her husband? She's an outcast. No one will have anything to do with her. It is a way of committing genocide, because if they can no longer have children, then the race is wiped out. Again, Richard Nixon, never again. 1992, Burundi, small little country in Africa. The Tutsi government murders over 200,000 of its own ethnic Hutu citizens. President Gerald Ford, never again. 1975 to 76. Over 1 million Cambodians are murdered by their own government and the Khmer Rouge as the United States and the world sits back and watches. President Jimmy Carter, never again. 77 to 79. Another 1 to 2 million Cambodians, again, are murdered by their own government as the world sits back and watches. President Ronald Reagan, never again. 1988, Iraq. Thousands of ethnic Kurds are murdered by their own government and Saddam Hussein as the United States and the world sits back and watched. How many of you have seen pictures of what happened to the Kurds? You know how they were killed? Anybody? Yes. How were they killed?
Weapons of mass destruction.
Absolutely. They were gassed to death. After we said never again. Never again, President H.W. Bush, 1989 to 92, Iraq. Thousands of more ethnic Kurds are murdered by their own government as the world sits back and watches. 1991 to 92, Bosnia. Over 100,000 Muslims are murdered by Christian Serbs as the world sat back and watched. Bill Clinton, never again. 1993 to 95, Bosnia. Another 150 to 200,000 Muslims are murdered by Christian Serbs before finally NATO intervened when a treaty was signed to stop the genocide that was going on there. President Bill Clinton, never again. 1998 to 99, Kosovo. 25 to 50,000 ethnic Albanian Muslims are murdered by Christian Serbs. We still don't know the numbers there, you all. You know why? Because today they are still digging up mass graves in Kosovo and counting the bodies. President Bill Clinton, 1994, Rwanda. 800,000 ethnic Tutsi are murdered by the Hutu government their own government in 93 days. You all, the Holocaust is considered from September 1st, 1939 to May the 8th, 1945, when the Nazis surrendered. 5.5 years, 6 million Jews were murdered. You all, the world sat back and watched 800,000 people be murdered in 93 days. Not systematically, not with gas chambers, not with ovens. Most of them were clubbed to death or were murdered with machetes. And just to give you an idea of what that is, you all, that's 8,602 people murdered every day. That's 358 murdered every hour. That's 6 people being murdered every single minute. And the world sat back and watched. President George W. Bush, never again, 2003 to 2009, in the Darfur region of the Sudan. Over 700,000 ethnic Sudanese are murdered by their own government, and 1 to 2 million have been displaced. Never again, President Barack Obama, January 20th, 2009 to present, as we sit in this room, April the 16th, 2014. Another 1 million ethnic Sudanese have been murdered in the Darfur region, and another 2 to 3 million have been displaced. That's why what happened to my parents over 70 years ago is important to each and every one of us sitting here in this room today. You all, 15 years after the Holocaust happened, young people like those of you sitting here that go to school here started reading about it, started seeing books, seeing documentaries about the Holocaust, and they went to their parents, they looked them in the eyes, and they asked them, you knew what was going on, what did you do to try and stop it? 15 years after Cambodia, young people your age started reading about it, seeing the documentaries about the killing fields. And young people your age looked their parents in the eyes and asked them, you knew what was going on, what did you try and do to stop it? Trust me when I tell you, to the young people sitting in this room today, 15, 16, 17 years from now, most of you are going to be married and you're going to have children. And trust me when I tell you, they're going to read about Darfur, they're going to start seeing the movies, they're going to start seeing the documentaries. And they're going to come to you and they're going to look you in the eyes and they're going to ask you, You knew what was happening there. What did you do to try and stop it? That's why what happened to my parents over 70 years ago is important to each and every one of us sitting here in this room today. How many of you all know what happened at Columbine High School, Littleton, Colorado, April 20th, 1999? 2 young men walked into their high school, proceeded to murder 12 of their classmates and one of their teachers, and then killed themselves, committed suicide. And when they found a videotape that these 2 young men had made about why they had done it, they did it because they had been bullied in their school by other students. We have no idea what's inside somebody's heart, inside of their head, and what the reaction is going to be when they're bullied, whether they do what these 2 young men did or they do what hundreds of kids have been doing every year, and that is going home and committing suicide. Sparks, Nevada, just October 2013, recent incident that just took place. Young boy walked in, shot a teacher, and wounded 2 of his students before they finally got him and arrested him. Same thing, you all. And I put something up here. Oh, there it is. I'm sorry. The United States, over 3 million incidents of bullying take place. The latest statistics from 2010 to 2011. I'm sorry, I need to go back here. Well, I don't know what happened to that one. Piper Smith, 13 years old, Spanaway, Washington, May 2009. Alex, 13 years old, Chesapeake, Virginia, February 2005. Phoebe Prince, Hadley, Massachusetts, January 14, 2010. Alexis Pinkleton, 17 years old, Long Island, New York, March 21, 2010. Jeff, 15 years old, Cape Coral, Florida, June 2005. Young people are very smart. Wasn't enough to bully them in school. We started the cyberbullying. So they couldn't get away from it, from their phones, from their computers. Each one of those young people right there committed suicide because they couldn't take it anymore. Not just walking into school, but even when they went home. And if you think, Rebecca Sedgwick, 12 years old, Lakeland, Florida, October 2013, just recently. They found the 2 girls who bullied her. And the older of the girls, who was 14, said, yeah, we bullied her. We know that she went and committed suicide. And her response was, IDGAF. I don't give a. And if you think Florida's a long ways off, then look at those names there and the dates, you all. That's here in your home community. 3 young people who committed suicide because of cyberbullying, that they couldn't take it anymore. Missouri, 2011, 2012, the latest statistics, 96,761 are the number of reported incidents of bullying that took place in schools here in the state of Missouri. Those statistics come from an organization called bullypolice.com, which monitors this kind of stuff. United States, again, over 3 million. 160,000 a day. That's the number of young people who do not go to school every single day in this country because of fear of being bullied when they walk into the classrooms. Every 7 minutes that school is in session, somebody is bullied. 4% adult, 11% peer. 4% of the time that an adult in a school sees a bullying incident taking place, intervenes. 4% of the time. Young people are a little bit better, almost 3 times better. 11% of the times when young people see it going on, will step in to do something about it. But that means 85% of the time, nobody, even when they're seeing it, does anything to stop it. Zach, come here. All right, speak loudly, Zach. I want you to tell everybody what you got there. What do you got there?
A plastic cup container.
What do you got there?
toothpaste.
All right, Zach, I want you to take the lid off the toothpaste and squeeze it in there.
Right on. All of it?
All of it. You're strong. Your coach told you, told me you could do
Of
this.
course.
Mike, I think
All right.
you lost your mic. They might not be able to.
Are you sure? No, they're both there.
It might not be.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. All right, well, I'll speak louder. Okay, I'll speak louder. Okay. You got it, Zach?
Yes, sir.
Great. Give him a hand. What a great job he just did. All right, now, Zach, I want you to put the toothpaste back in the tube.
Back in the tube?
Yeah.
Come on, Zach. You can do
I don't think you can do it, can you, Zach?
Can't.
Okay, the reason I had Zach do this, you all, it's the same thing with bullying. Once you've said it, once you've done something, you all, you can't put it back in the tube. Think about what you do every single day when you're in your schools, when you're in your community, about what goes on. Thanks, Zach, very much.
Thank you.
That's bullying. The other thing you all, Matt LeBron, coach, you'll love this. Football coach in Roosevelt, Utah. 49 players. After the first game, kicked all of them off of the team. Why? He said there were some character issues going on. Some of them had started missing classes and started doing some stuff that wasn't appropriate. But the most important thing of why he kicked them off the team, you all, was because of something else that happened in their school. There was a student who was being cyber-bullied in the school. Now, that he knows of, none of the football players were involved with it. It didn't matter to him. What mattered to him is that none of those 49 people were doing anything to try and stop it. They had to earn their way back onto the team. And they did. That's why, you all, what happened to my parents over 70 years ago is important to each and every one of you here in this room today. Oklahoma City, April 19, 1945, the bombing of the Murrah Federal Office Building. 168 innocent men, women, and children were murdered. Christian, Jews, Muslims. From a 3-month-old baby to an 88-year-old man who walked in for his Social Security check. By Timothy McVeigh, out of hatred and bigotry. How do I know out of hatred and bigotry? Because when they caught Timothy McVeigh, there was a book on the passenger side of his car called the Turner Diaries, which was an anti-Semitic, racist, anti-government book. And he had actually underlined anti-Semitic and racist comments in the book. Joplin, Missouri, August 7th, 2012, not that long ago, you all. A mosque was burned to the ground in your own home state here. April 18th, 1985. If you'd have gone to the internet day before the Oklahoma City bombing, you all, you would have found one hate website. Today there are over 2,000 of them, including www.gasajewforjesus.com and www.killahomoforgod.com. That's why what happened to my parents over 70 years ago is important to each and every one of us sitting here today. And I don't have to tell you what happened 3 days ago in Overland Park, Kansas, where an anti-Semite, neo-Nazi, racist bigot walked to the school, proceeded to open fire, killed 2 people at the school, and then went to the senior center where he killed somebody else before he was arrested. $15,000 is what they say. The Southern Poverty Law Center, 15,000 are the number of hate crimes that take place every year that are reported in this country. One hate crime takes place every hour. Every day, at least 8 blacks, 3 whites, 3 Jews, 1 Latino, 1 gay, and 1 Muslim are the victim of a hate crime. In 2013, there were 939 active hate groups 23 of them are here in Missouri. Various kinds of hate groups. 2013, there are 1,096 patriot groups, most of them anti-government groups. State of Missouri, you have 24 of them right here in your own community. That's why what happened to my parents over 70 years ago is important to each and every one of us sitting here today. If you take nothing else away from here today, you all, I want you to remember 3 numbers. The first number is 1.5 million. Nice, cute kids, right? None of those kids that I just showed you survived. 1.5 million children were murdered during the Holocaust. Young children who never had the opportunity to contribute to their families, to their religion, to their communities, to their towns, to their cities, to their countries, to the world, simply because of who they were. Second number I want you to remember is 1,183. Those are the number of children aged 5 and under who have starved to death in Africa and Asia while I've been standing here talking to you today. And you may say, what does that possibly have to do with the Holocaust? It has everything in the world to do with the Holocaust, you all, because it has to do with how we look at each other as human beings, especially when we're a different religion, a different ethnicity, or a different color. And the last number I have for you is 322,800. That's the number of children here in the state of Missouri that will go to bed hungry tonight. That's why what happened to my parents over 70 years ago is important to each and every one of you sitting here in this room today. Those 3 Christians who are in large part responsible that I can stand here and talk to you today, none of the 3 of them made it through World War II. 2 of them were murdered by the Nazis for helping Jews, Salke and Gorski, the police chief and the commissioner of roads. Gorski was sent to a concentration camp where he was killed in the camp. Salke was killed at his house when they went there, and he was hiding 2 Jews in the same attic that he had hidden out my dad's family. The 2 Jews jumped out of the attic window and were shot dead. And then they took John Salke out in front of his wife, his son, and his daughter, and they put a gun to his head, and they pulled the trigger. Joseph Wisniewski died in an accident. My parents, you all, were 2 of the most optimistic people that you could possibly meet in the world. With everything that they went through, they were just incredibly happy and optimistic people. Very quickly, I just want to point out one group to you, but up here you can see on the bottom down there, École Rue Michel Bizot, a middle school in France. The reason I point that out to you is because middle school means that they are younger than the people sitting here in this room today. When the Nazis finally conquered France, after a while, they issued the order that all Jews would begin wearing the Star of David. So the school principal called the Jewish students in the school and told them that the next day they would have to be wearing a Star of David. The next day when they came to school, this is just a picture of some of them. All of the Christian kids in that middle school, 14 and 15 years old, were wearing a Star of David so that the Nazis would not know who the Jews were and who the Christians were. Again, people willing to stand up to what was going on to the world around them. I had the opportunity to meet General Romeo Dallaire, who is Canadian. Now, why is he up there and why is he a hero? The reason he's a hero, you all, is he was in charge of 5,700 UN forces that was stationed in Rwanda before the genocide took place. And because of Bill Clinton, President Clinton, and the United States government, and the United Nations, and the world, they ordered over 5,000 of those troops to leave Rwanda. They finally ordered General Dallaire and the other 450 UN troops that he was commanding still, all of them Ghanaian, from the Africa of Ghana, to leave as well. He refused, and so did his soldiers. They are credited, you all, with saving 32,000 lives in Rwanda, simply by being there, which means if the United States and the United Nations had left those UN troops in Rwanda, probably 700,000 of those Rwandans that were murdered would still be alive today. That's why what happened to my parents over 70 years ago is important to each of us. And I tell you that because it's so important to understand that, yes, there are still heroes that exist in this world around us today. Those 13 young black kids in Oklahoma, General Dallaire, Henryk Gorski, Salke, and Wisniewski. My parents did not meet a single one of you sitting here in this room today except for Christy Weiberg and her husband. They had the opportunity to meet them before they passed away. But before I ever went to a group to speak, my parents would call me and tell me to give the group the same message that I was to give every group every time. And even though my parents are gone, they still want me to give you that message. When we were writing the book, you all, and went back to Poland, to my parents' hometown, we found Gorski's son, the one who snuck into the ghetto to warn my dad and his family, the one who brought them food. And needless to say, there were 1,000 questions I wanted to ask him, but there was only one question, you all, that was really important. And that question is why? Why would your father risk his life and risk his family's life to hide my dad's family and other Jews? And he looked at my dad and he answered in Polish because he didn't speak any English. And my dad looked at me and translated and said, he said, because he knew his father knew it was the right thing to do. My parents have hope and faith in every single one of you sitting here in this room today that you all are going to help make this a better world. And the reason that they believe that you are going to make this a better world because they believe that each and every one of you was born with something very special inside of you. And what they believe you were born with, you all, is a Wisniewski, a Salke, and a Gorski. That which is inside each of us that says, I will be willing to stand up and do the right thing because I know it's the right thing to do. Thank you all for having me here today.